The rain in Seattle doesn't always fall. Sometimes it just hangs in the air like a cold, wet shroud, blurring the lines between the gray sky and the gray asphalt. It was 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in mid-November when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, vibrating with a persistence that usually only means bad news or a wrong number. It was Martha Gable, a woman who had lived across the street from my son's old place in Bellevue for 15 years. She was the kind of neighbor who knew your delivery schedule better than you did, but she wasn't a gossip. She was a sentry. Her voice was thin and brittle over the line, competing with the sound of windshield wipers in the background. She told me she'd been heading to the Fred Meyer off Rainier Avenue in Renton for an early grocery run when she saw a truck tucked into the very back of the lot, squeezed between a rusted-out shipping container and a stack of wooden pallets. She said she recognized the dent in the tailgate, the one my son, Elias, had put there 5 years ago when he backed into a cedar post at my cabin. But it wasn't the truck that made her call. She told me she'd seen a small, pale hand wipe a circle into the condensation of the rear window, and for a split second, a pair of eyes looked out. She knew those eyes. They were the eyes of my granddaughter, Mia. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't even put on socks. I just pulled my boots over my bare feet, grabbed my keys, and drove. My heart wasn't racing. It was doing something much worse. It was sinking, getting heavier with every mile, as the reality of the last 3 months finally began to take its true, jagged shape. I found the truck exactly where she said it would be. It was a dark blue Chevy Silverado, a workhorse of a vehicle that I'd helped Elias pick out when he started his own structural consulting firm. Now, it looked like a carcass. There were black, heavy-duty trash bags taped over the back windows from the inside, a desperate attempt at insulation or privacy, or both. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady drumming on the roof of my car as I pulled up 3 spaces away. I sat there for a full minute, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. I was 66 years old, a man who had spent 40 years in the dirt and grit of heavy timber construction, a man who thought he'd seen every kind of collapse a structure could suffer. But as I stared at that truck, I realized I was looking at the total demolition of my family, and I hadn't even heard the charges go off. I stepped out into the mud and walked toward the driver's side. I didn't yell. I didn't pound. I just rapped my knuckles softly against the glass. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, the trash bag in the back shifted. A sliver of light from the parking lot lamp caught a face. It was Mia. She was 8, but in that dim, gray light, she looked like an old soul peering out from a cave. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just stared at me with a hollow, confused expression that I will see every time I close my eyes until the day I die. Then, the front seat reclined upward, and I saw my son. Elias looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His beard was a thick, matted mess, and his skin had a grayish, translucent quality, like parchment paper. The eyes that had once been sharp enough to spot a 3mm shift in a foundation were now bloodshot and unfocused. When he saw me, he didn't move for a long time. He just sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel as if he were still driving, still trying to get somewhere. When he finally opened the door, the smell hit me a mix of stale air, unwashed clothes, and the lingering scent of cheap, cold fast food. It was the smell of a man who had run out of options and was just waiting for the clock to stop. "Dad," he whispered. His voice was a dry rattle. He didn't say anything else. He didn't offer an excuse. He just looked at me and let out a shuddering breath that turned into a sob, the kind of deep, chest-racking sound a man only makes when he's completely broken. I didn't ask how he got there. I didn't ask why he hadn't called. I just reached out and put my hand on his shoulder, feeling the sharp points of his collarbone through his jacket. He'd lost at least 30 pounds. "Get the kids," I said, my own voice sounding like gravel. "We're going." I moved to the back door and opened it. My grandson, Toby, was 5 years old, curled into a ball under a pile of damp wool blankets. He was still wearing his puffer jacket, his hood pulled low over his ears. He looked up at me, his lip trembling, and held out a small, grimy hand. I picked him up, and he felt like nothing, just a bundle of shivering limbs. Mia climbed out behind him, clutching a ragged backpack like it contained everything left of her life. They were in their pajamas, their little sneakers caked in dried mud. I ushered them into the back of my heated SUV, wrapped them in the emergency blankets I kept in the trunk, and looked back at my son. He was standing by the truck, staring at the Fred Meyer sign as if he couldn't remember what day it was. "Elias," I said, sharper this time. "In the car. Now." We drove to a 2-4 hour diner called the Rusty Anchor in Des Moines. I picked it because it was far enough away from the parking lot to feel like a different world, but quiet enough that we wouldn't be noticed. I sat them in a back booth and ordered the biggest breakfast on the menu for the kids: pancakes, eggs, bacon, hot chocolate. I watched Toby eat with a frantic, animalistic speed, his small hands shaking as he shoved pieces of pancake into his mouth. Mia was slower, more methodical, but she kept looking at the door every time someone walked in. She was hunting for a threat I hadn't even identified yet. Elias just stared at a cup of black coffee, his hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. I let them eat in silence for 20 minutes. I knew that whatever story was about to come out was going to be ugly, and I needed my own strength to hear it. I am Silas Vance. I built half the luxury lodges in the Cascades. I know how to read people, and I know how to read a situation. I had known since the day Elias married Victoria Sterling that I was looking at a woman who didn't just want a husband, she wanted a trophy, and her family, the Sterlings, wanted a servant. Victoria was the daughter of Alistair Sterling, a man whose name was etched into the glass of half the high-rises in downtown Seattle. The Sterlings were old money by Washington standards, which meant they treated everyone else like they were just temporary residents on their land. Alistair was a man who believed that power wasn't something you earned, it was something you exerted until the world bent to your will. He had a son, Julian, who was a carbon copy of him, slick, arrogant, and possessed of a cruelty that was always wrapped in a custom-tailored suit. When Elias married Victoria, I tried to be the supportive father. I kept my mouth shut when Alistair made jokes about Elias's quaint little consulting firm. I didn't say anything when Victoria started insisting they move to a house in Mercer Island that they couldn't afford on Elias's salary alone. But I saw the way they looked at him. To the Sterlings, Elias was a tool. He was the smart, capable engineer who could fix their problems and give them beautiful grandchildren, but he was never, ever going to be one of them. "How long, Elias?" I asked, leaning across the table. He didn't look up from his coffee. 22 days in the truck, Dad. Before that, I don't know. The motels lasted a month. Then the credit cards were flagged. Then the accounts were just gone. Why didn't you call me? I felt a flash of anger, not at him, but at the sheer waste of it. You have a father. You have a home. I was ashamed, he whispered, finally meeting my eyes. And I was scared. Victoria. She didn't just leave me, Dad. She executed me. He started to talk then, the words spilling out like a dam had burst. It wasn't just a divorce. It had been a coordinated, military-grade strike. It started 6 months ago, though he hadn't seen the signs then. Victoria had begun a wellness campaign, telling their friends and her family that she was deeply concerned about Elias's mental health. She whispered about episodes, about a supposed hidden addiction to high-stakes online gambling. It was all a lie, a meticulously crafted narrative built brick by brick. She'd even managed to manipulate their joint bank records. Elias didn't know how then, but large sums of money were being moved into accounts he'd never heard of, making it look like he was draining their life savings. The killing blow came on a Tuesday night, just like this one. Elias had come home from a site visit in Tacoma to find 2 King County Sheriff's deputies in his driveway. They served him with an emergency protection order. Victoria had filed a sworn affidavit claiming he had become volatile, that he had threatened her and the children in a gambling-induced rage. She'd used the very bank records she'd faked as evidence of his instability. Within 2 hours, my son was escorted off the property he paid for, told he couldn't contact his wife, and stripped of his right to see his children. I tried to fight it, Elias said, his voice cracking. I hired a lawyer, but Alistair, he owns the firm that represents the firm I hired. They discovered a conflict of interest 3 weeks in and dropped me. By then, Victoria had filed for full temporary custody. She told the judge I was a flight risk because I'd stolen $60,000 from our kids' college funds. It was her, Dad. She took it. But the paper trail says it was me. He told me about the supervised visits 2 hours a week at a cold, fluorescent-lit social services center. He went every time. He brought toys, books, pieces of the life they used to have. And then, Victoria started the cancellations. A fever, a school play, a scheduling error. He'd sit in the parking lot for hours, watching the door, only to be told his time was up before it even started, the night I took them. Elias stopped, looking at Mia, who was watching him with wide, knowing eyes. Alistair's son, Julian, he called me. He told me Victoria was in Cabo with some developer named Marcus Thorne. He said Toby was sick, and Victoria's mother was too drunk to handle it. He told me to be a man and go get my kids because they were crying for a father who actually cared. Elias had gone. He'd driven to the Sterling estate in the middle of the night. Julian had met him at the gate, handed him the kids and a single suitcase, and smiled. It was a smile. I recognized the smile of a man who had just finished setting a trap. Elias realized too late that by taking the children without a court order, even at the invitation of the family, he had technically committed custodial interference. He was now a fugitive in the eyes of the family court. He couldn't go to his house. He couldn't go to a hotel without being tracked. He was terrified that if he called me, the police would be waiting at my door to take the kids away and put him in handcuffs. "So, you lived in a parking lot?" I said, the coldness in my chest turning into a white-hot coal of fury. "I didn't know what else to do," Elias choked out. "I just wanted them safe. I just wanted to keep them." I looked at my son, then at my grandkids. I saw the fear, the hunger, and the systematic destruction of a good man's life. The Sterlings thought they were playing a game of chess with a man who had no pieces left. They thought they could bury him in the mud of Renton and walk away with their legacy intact. I stood up and pulled out my phone. I hadn't been a contractor for 40 years without making a few friends in low places and a few very expensive friends in high ones. I looked at the rain-streaked window of the diner and saw the reflection of a man who was done being supportive. "Finish your breakfast," I told the kids. "Elias, get in my car. We're going to my house, and we're going to lock the gates. Dad, if they find out I'm with you, let them find out," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that made the waitress at the counter turn around. "I want them to know exactly where you are, because from this moment on, we aren't hiding. We're building a case, and when I'm done, I'm going to take the Sterling's world and I'm going to pull the load-bearing walls right out from under them." I walked to the register to pay, but as I reached for my wallet, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Mia. She looked up at me, her face pale but her eyes suddenly sharp. "Grandpa?" she whispered. "Yes, honey? Mom told the man on the phone that you were next," she said. "She said once Daddy was gone, they were going to take your cabin and the land. She said you were too old to keep it anyway." I felt a chill go down my spine that had nothing to do with the Seattle rain. This wasn't just a divorce, and it wasn't just about custody. This was a land grab. The Sterlings weren't just destroying my son, they were coming for everything I'd built in my entire life. "Is that right?" I said, patting her hand. "Well, Mia, your mom forgot one thing about me." "What's that?" "I don't just build things," I said. "I know exactly how to tear them down." I walked out of the diner into the pouring rain, my mind already spinning. I didn't know it yet, but the man Victoria was with in Cabo, Marcus Thorne, wasn't just a boyfriend. He was the key to a secret that would eventually burn the Sterling Empire to the ground. But for now, I had a son to save and a war to start. My house is a timber frame fortress, tucked away on 40 acres of rugged land near the Snoqualmie River. I built it with my own 2 hands back when my back was strong and my knees didn't pop like dry kindling every time I stood up. It's a place made of cedar, stone, and heavy iron bolts, a place built to withstand the kind of Pacific Northwest storms that can rip the shingles right off a lesser man's roof. As I pulled through the heavy iron gates and heard them hiss shut behind us, I felt a momentary sense of relief, but it was thin. You can lock the gates against the world, but you can't lock out the damage that's already been done. I spent the next 3 hours in a blur of quiet efficiency. I got the kids into the guest wing, a part of the house I'd built specifically for when they came to visit, though I never imagined they'd arrive as refugees. I watched Mia help Toby into a hot bath, her movements stiff and robotic, like a soldier who had forgotten how to be a child. I made them grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, the kind of simple, warm food that grounds a person, and I didn't say a word until I saw the color finally start to return to their cheeks. Elias sat at the kitchen island, his head in his hands, vibrating with a nervous energy that made me think of a bridge about to buckle under a harmonic resonance. Once the children were tucked into beds with clean sheets, their breathing finally evening out into the deep sleep of the exhausted, I led Elias into my study. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon for both of us, though I knew he didn't really want it. He needed the burn of it to remind him he was still alive. "Tell me about the beginning," I said, sitting across from him. "Not the parking lot, not the sheriff. Tell me when the rot actually started. I need to know the foundation we're standing on before I start digging." Elias looked at the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes distant. "It was the wedding, Dad. You remember. The Sterling Gala, as Alistair called it. I remembered. It was held at their estate in Highlands, a place that felt more like a museum than a home. I had felt like a grizzly bear in a tuxedo, surrounded by people who spoke in soft, polished tones about things that didn't matter. Alistair Sterling had pulled me aside that night, his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt less like a greeting and more like a buyer inspecting a piece of livestock. He told me how brave it was of Elias to start his own firm in such a volatile market. And then he'd offered to help by introducing Elias to his board of directors. At the time, I thought it was just the arrogance of a wealthy man. Now, I realized it was the first hook. Elias began to recount the last 2 years, and as he spoke, the picture became sickeningly clear. Victoria hadn't just changed, she had been coached. It started with the wellness retreat's expensive weekends in Sedona and Napa funded by her father. She'd come back talking about spiritual alignment and emotional safety. She began suggesting that Elias was too intense, that his dedication to his firm was a sign of an avoidant personality. It was classic gaslighting, a slow, methodical chipping away at a man's confidence. Then came the financial pressure. Victoria insisted on a lifestyle that was a constant stress test for Elias's consulting firm. The Mercer Island house wasn't just a home. It was a cage with a massive mortgage. When Elias tried to pull back, Alistair would step in with a short-term loan or a consulting fee for a project that never seemed to materialize. They were wrapping him in a web of debt and obligation, all while Victoria was telling their social circle that Elias was struggling with the pressure. The gambling lies. They weren't just talk, Dad, Elias whispered, his voice trembling. Julian, her brother, he took me to a private club in Belltown about a year ago. He said it was for networking. There were high-stakes games in the back. I never played. I swear to you, I never placed a single bet. But Julian, he'd buy me drinks, introduce me to people, and always make sure I was standing near the tables. He even took photos of us celebrating a big win. I thought he was just being a loudmouth jerk. I didn't realize he was building a gallery of evidence. I felt the familiar heat of rage rising in my throat. This was a professional-grade demolition. They hadn't just wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to strip him of his reputation so he could never fight back. If he was a gambler and unstable, no judge would give him the kids, and no client would hire his firm. They were turning him into a ghost. And Marcus Thorne? I asked, remembering what Mia had said in the diner. Elias's face went pale. Thorne is a predator. He's a commercial developer who specializes in distressed assets. He buys up properties that are in legal limbo or foreclosure and flips them into high-end condos. He and Alistair have been partners on 3 projects in the last 5 years. I didn't know Victoria was seeing him until I saw his car at the house 2 weeks before the sheriff showed up. When I confronted her, she didn't even deny it. She just looked at me with this pitying expression and said, "Elias, you're clearly having a breakdown. Marcus is just helping the family through this." The pieces were clicking into place, and the sound they made was like a hammer hitting a nail. This wasn't just about a mistress or a broken marriage. The Sterlings were looking to expand their footprint into the Snoqualmie Valley. My land, 40 acres of prime riverfront property that I'd refused to sell to developers for decades, was the missing piece of a massive luxury resort project. Marcus Thorne had been trying to greenlight for years. They weren't just trying to destroy Elias. They were using him as a lever to get to me. If they could prove Elias was unstable and that I was enabling his behavior, or if they could bankrupt us both through a protracted legal war, they could force a sale. They think I'm an old man who's lost his teeth, I said, more to myself than to Elias. They think they can starve us out and then pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had turned into a thick mist, obscuring the trees. I didn't know it yet, but the Sterling family had a much darker secret buried in their financial records, something that even Victoria didn't know. But to find it, I needed a different kind of tool. I needed someone who didn't care about old money or social standing. The next morning, I made a phone call to a man named Silas Vaxley. He was a forensic accountant who had spent a decade working for the IRS before deciding he preferred the higher pay and lower moral threshold of the private sector. Vax was a man who saw the world in spreadsheets and hidden offshore accounts. We'd met years ago when I was doing a timber clearing job for a site that turned out to be a front for a money laundering scheme. I'd helped him stay alive long enough to testify, and he'd told me then that he owed me a life debt. "Silas," Vax's voice crackled over the encrypted line, "I haven't heard from you since you retired to your mountain. Don't tell me you've finally decided to embezzle." I need a deep dive, Vax. A total structural analysis of the Sterling Group and Alistair Sterling's personal holdings. And I need to know everything there is to know about a man named Marcus Thorne. The Sterlings? Vax whistled. That's a tall order, Silas. Those people have more layers than a redwood. Their money is buried under 20 years of shell companies and charitable foundations. Why the sudden interest? They went after my son, I said. And they're coming for my land. The silence on the other end of the line lasted a long time. When Vax spoke again, his voice was stripped of its usual sarcasm. I'll start digging. But Silas, be careful. People like Alistair Sterling don't just hire lawyers. They hire people who make problems go away. If you're going to pull on this thread, make sure you're standing on solid ground. I've been standing on this ground my whole life, I said. It isn't going anywhere. Over the next few days, the house felt like a command center. Elias was slowly regaining his footing, though the shadows under his eyes remained. He spent his time with the kids, trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy, while I waited for Vax to call back. I watched my grandchildren play in the woods behind the house, and I felt a fierce, protective ache in my chest. They were so small, so unaware of the wolves circling the gate. The first blow from the Sterlings came on Friday afternoon. A black sedan pulled up to the gate, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out. He didn't wait for me to buzz him in. He simply tucked a thick manila envelope into the gate's mailbox and drove away. I walked down the long driveway in the biting cold to retrieve it. Inside was a legal notice, a motion filed in King County Court. Victoria was seeking an emergency permanent injunction to bar Elias from having any contact with the children, citing kidnapping and imminent danger to their physical safety, based on the fact that he had taken them from the Sterling estate. But there was a second document too. It was a formal notice of intent to inspect from the county building department. Someone had filed an anonymous tip that my timber frame home was built without the proper permits and was a hazardous structure. They were starting the squeeze. They were attacking the children's safety in court and the safety of their sanctuary at the same time. It was a classic pincer movement. I went back to the house, my heart thumping a steady, rhythmic beat of war. I didn't tell Elias about the building inspector. I didn't want to break the fragile peace he was finding, but I did call Vax. Tell me you found something, I said. I found something, Vax replied, his voice sounding tight. But it's not what you think, Silas. Marcus Thorne isn't just Alistair's partner. He's his insurance policy. I found a series of transfers, very large, very quiet, moving from the Sterling Group's pension fund into an account controlled by Thorne. It looks like Alistair has been raiding his own company to fund Thorne's developments for years. But that's not the kicker. What is it? Thorne is currently under a quiet federal investigation for a Ponzi scheme involving luxury resorts. The feds are just waiting for him to make one more big land acquisition to prove he's using new investor money to pay off the old ones. And, Silas, the land they're looking at? The flagship property for the whole scam? It's yours. I looked out at the Snoqualmie River, the water churning gray and violent against the rocks. The Sterlings weren't just trying to steal my land. They needed it to keep their entire empire from collapsing. They were desperate, and desperate people are the most dangerous kind of predators. I was about to hang up when I heard a sound from the guest wing, a sharp, muffled cry. I dropped the phone and ran toward the kids' room. I burst through the door, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy mag light I kept on my belt. The room was empty. The window was wide open, the cold rain blowing in across the empty beds. And on the floor, lying in a puddle of water, was Mia's favorite stuffed horse, its head ripped clean off. I felt a coldness settle over me that I knew I would never truly shake. They hadn't waited for the court order. They had breached the fortress. My heart didn't just beat, it slammed against my ribs like a sledgehammer hitting a hollowed-out log. I didn't waste a breath shouting for them. In the woods, shouting only alerts the predator that the prey is panicked. I spun around, my eyes scanning the room for what didn't fit. The mud on the windowsill was fresh, dark, and loamy, the kind of dirt you only find down by the riverbank. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and stepped out into the hallway, where I nearly collided with Elias. He'd heard the window slam. He saw my face, saw the empty room behind me, and the color drained from his skin until he looked like a ghost. "They're gone," he choked out, his voice cracking. "Dad, they took them. Oh God, they took them." "Quiet," I hissed, grabbing his arm. My grip was probably too hard, but I needed him grounded. Look at the floor. No drag marks, no signs of a struggle. The window was open from the inside. They weren't taken, Elias. They ran. I knew my grandkids. I'd spent every summer teaching them the rules of the mountain. Rule number 1. If a stranger comes to the door and Grandpa isn't there, you go to the root cellar. The root cellar wasn't actually for vegetables. It was a reinforced concrete bunker I'd built into the hillside behind the house back in the late 90s, when the world was convinced the power grids were going to melt down. It was hidden under a false wood pile, vented through a hollowed-out cedar stump. I led Elias out the back mudroom, my flashlight cutting a sharp, white path through the mist. The rain was turning to a freezing sleet that stung my cheeks. We moved fast, our boots crunching over the frozen pine needles. When we reached the woodpile, I didn't see anything at first. Then, I noticed the way the stack of Douglas fir was leaning. It was off by an inch. I knelt, pulled back a heavy tarp, and tapped a specific rhythm on the steel hatch buried beneath, shave and a haircut. A second later, the hatch groaned open. Mia's face appeared in the gap, her eyes wide and wet with tears, but her jaw was set in that stubborn sterling line she'd inherited from her mother, the only part of Victoria I didn't want to bury. She was holding a kitchen knife, the small paring one I used for peeling apples. Behind her, Toby was curled into a ball, clutching a flashlight like it was a holy relic. "Grandpa," Mia whispered. There was a man. He was outside the window. He had a mask on, like a hunter. I felt a cold rage settle into my marrow, a deep, ancient heat that suppressed the tremor in my hands. I reached down and lifted them out one by one, handing them to their father. Elias collapsed onto the ground, sobbing as he pulled them into his chest, burying his face in Toby's neck. I stood over them, my back to the woods, my eyes searching the tree line. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel it. The woods were breathing. Someone was watching us from the shadows of the hemlocks, waiting to see how I'd react. "Into the house," I said, my voice as flat as a sheet of galvanized steel. "Elias, get them into the interior den. No windows. Lock the door from the inside. If you hear anything other than my voice, you call the sheriff and you tell them there's an armed intruder on the property." "Where are you going?" Elias asked, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm going to finish my conversation with Vax," I said. "And then I'm going to make sure that Hunter understands he's on the wrong side of the fence." Once they were barricaded in the den, I went back to my study and locked the door. My hand was steady as I picked up the phone. Vax was still on the line, the encrypted connection humming with static. He'd heard the whole thing, the panic, the search, the realization. "Silas," Vax said, his voice low. "That wasn't a kidnapping attempt. If they wanted the kids, they would have taken them. That was a message. They wanted you to know that your fortresses isn't as tight as you think it is. They're trying to provoke you into doing something stupid. If you go out there with a shotgun and start blasting into the trees, Alistair will have the state patrol up there in 20 minutes to arrest you for reckless endangerment. Then Elias is alone, and the kids go back to Victoria by default." "I know the play, Vax," I said, leaning back into my leather chair. "Alistair Sterling is a man of systems. He uses the law like a garrote, but systems have a weakness. They rely on the people inside them to follow the rules." "What are you thinking? You said Marcus Thorne is under investigation by the feds. You said he needs my land to close his Ponzi loop. If that loop doesn't close, the whole thing collapses, right? Alistair loses the pension funds he borrowed, and Thorne goes to a federal penitentiary." "Exactly," Vax said. "They're on a clock, Silas. That's why they're getting sloppy. That's why they sent a goon to your window. They need you to break before the feds finish their audit." "Then we're going to speed up the clock," I said. "I need you to look into the Sterling Group's subsidiary companies. Specifically, a firm called Highland Logistics. My gut tells me that's where they're hiding the forged signatures Elias mentioned. Victoria isn't smart enough to handle the technical side of the banking fraud. She's the face, but Julian is the one who handles the logistics. I'll dig," Vax promised. "But Silas, you need a lawyer who isn't afraid of Alistair Sterling. Someone who doesn't play golf at the same clubs. I know a woman in Olympia. Her name is Sarah Garrett. She used to be a prosecutor for the Organized Crime Division. She's got a grudge against the Sterling family that goes back 10 years. I'll send you her encrypted handle." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time. I thought about Victoria. I remembered the first time Elias brought her to the cabin. She'd worn $500 boots and spent the whole afternoon complaining about the lack of cell service. I'd watched her watch my son, and I'd seen it then she didn't love him. She loved the way he looked at her. She loved the power she had over a man who was so fundamentally decent that he couldn't imagine someone being fundamentally cruel. Elias had been her project. She'd spent years molding him, pushing him to be the successful man her father demanded, all while quietly resenting him for not being born to it. And when he finally hit his limit, when he tried to protect his firm's integrity instead of cutting corners for one of Alistair's developments, she didn't just leave. She decided to erase him. She'd turned his own children into weapons, teaching them to fear the man who would have walked through fire for them. The next morning, the official assault began. At 9 a.m., a convoy of 3 vehicles pulled up to my gate: a King County Sheriff's cruiser, a black sedan, and a nondescript white van. I met them at the gate, standing on my side of the iron bars. The deputy was a young man named Miller. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting toward the house. Beside him was a woman in a sharp gray suit who introduced herself as an agent from Child Protective Services. And behind them, leaning against the black sedan, was Julian Sterling. He looked exactly like a man who had never done a day's labor in his life. His hair was perfectly swept back, his teeth a blinding white against a year-round tan. He smiled at me, a lazy, arrogant expression that made my knuckles ache. "Mr. Vance," the CPS worker said, her voice professional and cold, "we've received a report of custodial interference and potential child endangerment. We have a court order signed by Judge Halloway mandating the immediate return of Mia and Toby Calloway to their legal guardian, Victoria Sterling. I have a temporary custody order from an emergency hearing 3 days ago," I said, holding up a laminated copy of the document Carol Whitfield had secured. "That order has been stayed," Julian piped up, his voice smooth as silk. "New evidence came to light last night, Silas. Seems your son had a bit of a breakdown in a Fred Meyer parking lot. Endangered the kids. The court decided that until a full psych evaluation is completed, the kids belong with their mother. And given the Anonymous's report about the safety of this structure, we're here to take them." "You aren't taking anyone," I said. "Not until I talk to my attorney. We have the sheriff right here, Silas," Julian said, stepping closer to the bars. He lowered his voice so the others couldn't hear. "Don't make this hard. You're an old man. You don't want to spend your golden years in a cell because you tried to play hero for a loser like Elias. Just give us the kids, sign the intent to sell for the riverfront acreage, and we can make the endangerment charges go away. Victoria might even let Elias see them on Christmas. Through glass, of course." I looked at Julian Sterling, and for a second, I didn't see a wealthy developer's son. I saw a dry rot beam shiny on the outside, but complete dust in the middle. I leaned in, my face inches from his. "You've got a leak, Julian," I whispered. The smile faltered just a fraction. "What?" "In your father's pension fund, Highland Logistics. It's a sieve. And Marcus Thorne? He's not going to Cabo to wait for Victoria. He's going there because he's looking for a country without an extradition treaty. You're standing on a sinkhole, son, and you just brought the heavy equipment right to the edge." I stepped back and looked at Deputy Miller. "Deputy, you're welcome to come inside and verify the children are safe. But the CPS worker and Mr. Sterling stay outside. If any of them set a foot on my property without a specific warrant for this address, I'll consider it trespassing. And in this county, we take our boundary lines very seriously." Miller looked at Julian, then back at me. He was a local boy. He knew my reputation. He nodded slowly. "Just the children, Silas. I just need to see them." The inspection was a tense, silent affair. Miller saw the kids, saw they were fed and clean, and he saw the fear in their eyes, not of me, but of the people waiting at the gate. He didn't say much, but as he walked back to his cruiser, he paused. "Silas," he said, low, "I have to serve the stay on the custody order. It means Elias has to turn them over by 5 o'clock tonight at the precinct in North Bend. If he doesn't, I'll have to come back with a warrant for his arrest. My hands are tied." "I understand, Miller," I said. "You're doing your job." As the convoy pulled away, Julian leaned out the window of the sedan and threw a playful salute. I watched them disappear down the gravel road. Then I turned back to the house. Elias was standing on the porch, his face buried in his hands. "We have 8 hours, I said as I walked up the stairs. "To do what?" Elias asked, looking up. "They're going to take them, Dad. The law is on their side." "The law is a tool, Elias. Right now they're using it like a hammer. We're going to use it like a scalpel." I went to my computer and opened the encrypted message from Vax. It contained a single file, a scanned ledger from Highland Logistics. It showed a series of payments made to a consultant over the last year. The consultant's name was redacted, but the bank routing number wasn't. I recognized that number. It was the same one Victoria had used to pay the deposit on the Mercer Island house. But there was something else. A second file. A series of emails between Victoria and Marcus Thorne, dated months before the divorce filing. In them, Victoria wasn't just talking about leaving Elias. She was talking about liquidating the Vance assets. She was promising Thorne that she could deliver the 40 acres of Snoqualmie riverfront as part of the divorce settlement, claiming it was rightfully hers as part of the marital estate. She had sold my land before she'd even filed the papers. But the real shock came at the very bottom of the file. Vax had found a digital footprint, a login to the bank account where the gambling money had gone. The login didn't come from Victoria's computer. It came from a device registered to the Sterling Group's headquarters. And the password? It was the name of the dog Elias had when he was a kid. A dog only a few people knew the name of. I felt a sudden, sharp realization hit me. This wasn't just Victoria and her father. There was someone else inside our circle, someone who knew our history, someone who had been feeding them the intimate details they needed to destroy Elias from the inside. I walked into the kitchen where the kids were coloring. I looked at Mia, who was drawing a picture of a house with a very tall fence. "Mia," I said softly, "when you were at your great-grandpa Alistair's house, did you ever see anyone else there? Someone who wasn't a Sterling? Maybe someone who used to work with your dad?" Mia looked up, her crayon hovering over the paper. "You mean Uncle Marcus?" "No, someone else." "There was a lady," Mia said. "She had red hair. She told me she was my new auntie. She said she used to be Daddy's best friend at his office." I felt the air leave my lungs. Sarah Miller, Elias's lead designer. The woman he'd trusted with every blueprint, every financial secret, and every password for the last 5 years. The betrayal didn't just go deep, it was structural. I looked at the clock. 7 hours left. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Sarah Garrett in Olympia. "Miss Garrett," I said when she answered. "My name is Silas Vance. I'm told you don't like the Sterlings. I have a ledgers, a forged signature, and a betrayal that's about to go public. How fast can you get to North Bend?" "I can be there in 3, she said. "But Silas, if we do this, there's no going back. We aren't just winning a custody battle. We're going to burn their entire legacy to the ground. Are you ready for that?" "I've spent 40 years building things," I said, looking out at the river. "I think it's time I saw how a demolition feels." I hung up and looked at Elias. "Pack the kids' bags. We're going to the precinct, but we aren't going there to give them up. We're going there to hold a press conference." I didn't know it yet, but as we pulled out of the driveway, a second black sedan was already tucked into a logging road a mile down the hill, and the man inside was putting a suppressor on a 9mm pistol. The Sterlings weren't waiting for the law anymore. The drive down the mountain toward North Bend was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. The rain had turned back into a heavy, wet slush that stuck to the windshield like wet wool. In the backseat, Mia and Toby were strapped in, surrounded by a fortress of duffel bags and stuffed animals. They weren't crying anymore. That was the most heartbreaking part. They had reached a level of survivalist silence that no child should ever know. Elias sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the passing hemlocks with a look of such profound devastation that I thought he might actually shatter if I hit a pothole. I knew what was killing him. It wasn't the law, and it wasn't the Sterlings. It was Sarah Miller. He'd spent the last hour in the house going through his old project logs on a backup drive I'd kept in my safe. Every time he found a discrepancy, a forged signature, or a diverted fund, Sarah's digital fingerprints were all over it. She was the one who had helped him build Vance Structural Consulting from a one-man operation into a firm that handled multi-million-dollar contracts. She was the one who knew the names of his childhood pets, the anniversary of his mother's passing, and the exact combination to his office safe. She hadn't just betrayed his business, she had sold the intimate architecture of his life to the highest bidder. She was at the hospital when Toby was born. "Dad," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. "She brought Victoria flowers. She held my son before my own sister did. How do you look someone in the eye for 5 years while you're planning to erase them? Some people aren't built with a conscience, Elias," I said, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "They're built with a balance sheet. To Sarah Miller, you weren't a friend. You were an asset that had reached its peak value. The Sterlings offered her a buyout, and she took it. I didn't tell him about the black sedan I'd spotted in the mirror 3 miles back. It was staying exactly 4 car lengths behind us. A nondescript Ford Interceptor with tinted windows, the kind of car that's designed to disappear into traffic. I knew it wasn't the sheriff. Deputy Miller wouldn't be following us. He'd be waiting at the precinct. This was something else. This was the insurance policy Vax had warned me about. We pulled into the parking lot of the North Bend precinct at 4:15 p.m. The Sterlings were already there. They hadn't just sent a lawyer. They had turned the lobby of the police station into a theater of humiliation. Alistair Sterling was standing near the front desk, looking like he'd stepped off the cover of a yachting magazine. Victoria was beside him, draped in a cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than Elias's truck. She was holding a designer tissue to her eyes, playing the part of the grieving mother for the benefit of anyone watching. Julian was leaning against a vending machine, tapping on his phone, looking bored by the whole affair. And standing right next to Victoria, looking perfectly composed in a charcoal blazer, was Sarah Miller. I felt Elias's body go rigid, his breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound. I put my hand on his forearm, pinning him to the seat for a second. "Steady," I said. "They want a scene. They want you to scream and shout so they can point to the cameras and say, 'Look how unstable he is.' Don't give them the satisfaction. We're here to play the long game." We stepped out of the SUV. The cold air hit us like a physical blow. I took Toby's hand, and Elias grabbed Mia's. As we walked toward the glass doors, the black sedan that had been following us pulled into a spot across the street. A man in a dark hoodie got out, but he didn't head for the station. He headed for the coffee shop on the corner, never once looking in our direction. He was good, professional. The moment we entered the lobby, Victoria let out a theatrical gasp. "My babies!" she cried, rushing forward. Elias didn't move. He stood his ground, his grip firm on Mia's hand. Deputy Miller stepped between them, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Easy, Mrs. Calloway. Let's do this by the book. Mr. Vance, thank you for coming in." "We're following the order, Deputy," I said, my voice carrying through the quiet lobby. "But before we hand over these children, I want it on the record that they are being released into the care of a woman who is currently under investigation for financial fraud and custodial interference." Alistair Sterling stepped forward, his eyes like two chips of blue ice. "Silas, don't be tedious. Your son had a breakdown. He took the children across state lines. He never left the county, Alistair," I interrupted. "And you know it. He was in a parking lot 10 miles from his home because you froze his accounts using forged documents. Documents provided by that woman standing behind you." I pointed directly at Sarah Miller. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just looked at Elias with a touch of calculated pity. "Elias," she said softly, "you need help. The gambling, the paranoia, it's destroyed you." I stayed as long as I could to protect the firm, but I had to tell the truth eventually. The sheer, naked audacity of the lie almost broke Elias. He took a step toward her, his face flushing deep red. "The truth? You emptied the escrow account, Sarah. You gave them my login. I treated you like a sister." "See?" Julian chimed in, pointing a finger. "Look at the aggression. He's a ticking time bomb. Deputy, for the safety of my sister and those kids, we need to finalize this now." At that moment, the heavy glass doors opened again, and a woman walked in who looked like she'd been forged in a furnace. Sarah Garrett didn't look like a lawyer. She looked like a high-altitude mountaineer. She was wearing a practical parka over a sharp suit, and she was carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen combat. She didn't look at the Sterlings. She walked straight to me and Elias. "I'm Sarah Garrett," she said, her voice a low, authoritative hum. "I represent Elias Calloway and Silas Vance. Deputy Miller, I have a countermotion filed 45 minutes ago in the King County Superior Court. It's an emergency stay on the transfer based on newly discovered evidence of felony fraud and witness tampering." Alistair's lawyer, a man named Henderson who looked like he'd been carved out of mahogany, stepped forward. "That's impossible. No judge would sign a stay this late in the day." "Judge Whitman did," Garrett said, pulling a tablet from her bag and showing the digital signature. "And he did it because I presented him with a sworn affidavit from a forensic accountant regarding the Highland Logistics ledger. It seems there's a direct line of credit between Alistair Sterling's personal holdings and Sarah Miller's private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. A series of payments totaling $400,000, all dated within the last 6 months. The silence that hit the lobby was absolute. I watched Sarah Miller's face. The composure didn't break, but a small muscle in her jaw began to twitch. Victoria's grieving mother act vanished, replaced by a sharp, panicked look toward her father. That's a private business matter, Alistair said, though his voice had lost its resonance. It has nothing to do with the welfare of my grandchildren. It has everything to do with it, Garrett countered. If you paid a key witness for the petitioner to fabricate evidence of a gambling addiction, that's not just a civil matter. It's a criminal conspiracy to defraud the court. And until the validity of those gambling records is verified by a court-appointed expert, the status quo remains. The children stay with Silas Vance. Now wait just a minute, Deputy Miller said, looking between the two groups. I have a standing order here. And you have a stay on that order, Deputy? Garrett said firmly. Check your system. It was uploaded 10 minutes ago. Miller walked behind the desk to his computer. The Sterlings huddled together, a flurry of whispered, angry words passing between them. Victoria was clutching Julian's arm so hard her knuckles were white. Julian was staring at me, his eyes filled with a dark, simmering hatred. He wasn't the bored playboy anymore. He was a cornered animal. The stay is there, Miller said, looking up from the screen. He sounded relieved. Mr. Vance, the children stay with you. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you take this up with the judge in the morning. This isn't over, Silas, Alistair said, his voice a low hiss as he walked past me. You think a little forensic accounting is going to stop me? I've bought and sold better men than you before breakfast. You're protecting a man who couldn't even keep his own wife's interest. Enjoy the house while you can. By the end of the month, the county will have condemned it, and your son will be in a state facility. Alistair, I said, stopping him at the door. You're right about one thing. I am an old man. And at my age, you realize that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man with money. It's a man with nothing left to lose. As they filed out, Sarah Miller paused in front of Elias. For the first time, she looked at him with something other than pity. It was a cold, calculated assessment. You should have taken the deal, Elias, she whispered. You have no idea what Marcus has planned for that riverfront. You've just signed your father's death warrant. She walked out, and for a moment, the lobby was quiet. Elias slumped against a plastic chair, the adrenaline leaving him all at once. Mia and Toby clung to my legs, sensing the shift in the air. We won? Elias asked, looking up at Sarah Garrett. We won the round, Garrett said, her expression grim. But Silas is right. They're going to escalate. The fact that they're using Sarah Miller so openly means they're desperate. They need that land to cover the hole in their pension fund before the feds move in. They won't wait for another court date. What do we do? Elias asked. We go back to the house, I said, and we get ready. But as we walked out to the SUV, I saw the man in the dark hoodie standing by the black sedan across the street. He wasn't drinking coffee anymore. He was looking directly at us. And as I started the engine, I realized something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't looking at me. And he wasn't looking at Elias. He was looking at the fuel tank of my SUV. I didn't say a word. I just backed out of the spot and drove toward the highway, my mind racing. I didn't know it yet, but the Sterlings hadn't just hired a hunter. They had hired someone who knew exactly how to make a structural failure look like an accident, and we were currently driving 60 miles an hour in a 3-ton bomb. Dad? Elias said, noticing my grip on the wheel. What is it? Keep the kids low, I said, my voice steady, despite the roar of my heart. And don't ask why. I slammed my foot on the brake as we reached the entrance to the I-90 on-ramp. The car didn't slow down. The pedal went straight to the floor with a sickening, hollow squelch. The brake lines had been cut, and we were heading straight for a steep, winding descent into the valley with no way to stop. The sensation of a brake pedal going to the floor is a specific kind of horror. It's not a sudden snap. It's a soft, yielding surrender that tells you the mechanical bond between you and the road has been severed. I didn't pump the pedal. I knew the fluid was already painting the asphalt behind us. I looked at the speedometer, 62 miles per hour. We were at the crest of the Snoqualmie Pass descent, a winding ribbon of wet concrete that dropped 800 feet in less than 3 miles. To our right was a sheer rock face. To our left, a staggered guardrail and a 300-foot plunge into the Douglas firs. Dad? Elias asked again, his voice rising in pitch. He saw my foot frantically tapping the useless pedal. He looked at the dash, then at me, his eyes wide with the realization of what was happening. The brakes are gone, I said, my voice sounding unnervingly calm even to my own ears. It was the site foreman voice, the one I used when a crane cable snapped or a foundation shifted. Elias, listen to me. Reach back and make sure the kids' harnesses are tight. Do it now. Don't let them see you panic. I grabbed the gear shifter. It was an older SUV, a heavy beast with a manual override. I slapped it into low gear. The engine roared, the tachometer needle leaping into the red as the transmission groaned under the sudden strain of the car's momentum. We jerked forward, the seatbelts locking against our chests. The speed dropped to 55, but the gravity of the grade was fighting back. "They're tight, Dad," Elias choked out, his hands trembling as he turned back around. "What do we do?" "There's a hairpin turn at the bottom of this stretch." "I know," I said. I glanced in the side mirror. The black sedan was there, a shadow in the mist at the top of the hill. They weren't closing the gap, they were spectating. They wanted to watch the accident happen. They wanted a clean exit, a grieving father-in-law,